Recently, I heard a speech by your president, Evo Morales, which he made in New York in the United Nations. And that speech was about how we need to decolonize our countries in the developing world. And I think he is right, and he is very brave as a political leader to say that. After all, our countries have already gained political independence. So what is he grumbling about? That we have to decolonize. And the truth is that after independence, we are still very dependent on the Western countries, and they have formulated methods to continue to control our economy and even our culture, even though they already surrendered their political control over our countries. We have the World Bank and IMF, and if countries fall into debt, they cannot repay their debt. They have to follow the conditions of the World Bank and IMF, and these conditions are that you have to surrender your economy back to the foreigners. The World Bank and IMF tells you that the government should not control any natural resources or any companies. You have to privatize. But since we don't have a private sector that is very strong, when you privatize, it is the foreign companies that will take over the resources and the companies of the government. They also force the governments to reduce the tariff almost to zero. So this results in the imports coming in and destroying the market, destroying the local farmers and the local companies, because the imported materials are cheaper. That is why many countries in Africa and also in Latin America, including Bolivia, became very poor. But those countries, for example in Asia, they did not come under World Bank and IMF. They were free to have their own policies, and the policies were different from the World Bank and IMF. And those countries were able to develop with fast economic growth. Then they created the World Trade Organization. It used to be about trade. I'm selling you apples and you're selling me bicycles. But now the WTO also has signed agreements on intellectual property rights, on liberalization of services, meaning that foreigners can come into the country and set up their banks, their companies, which can threaten the survival of the local companies. Under the intellectual property treaty, we have to allow foreigners to come in and patent, including medicines and food and agricultural materials. Because they have the monopoly, our local companies will not be able to make the same medicines or use the same technology, and our farmers are threatened in that perhaps they are not able even to use the seeds in the future. Then they also have bilateral treaties, bilateral free trade agreements. For example, the European Union has signed with Peru and Colombia. The United States has signed with Mexico, Chile, Peru and Colombia also. And fortunately, luckily, Bolivia has refused to sign these kinds of free trade agreements. If you sign these agreements, definitely your economy will be colonized again. Your tariff has to be brought down to zero, and the foreign products will take over the market from the local farmers and also from the local industry. A few months ago, the farmers in Colombia protested against the government by blocking the roads. Because after the free trade agreement was signed with the United States, the very cheap American subsidized food came in and took over the markets away from the local farmers in Colombia. Under these agreements, you have to sign an investment treaty, an investment chapter, which allows the foreign companies, the banks, the water companies, the universities to come into the country. And in many of these countries, the local banks, the local companies went bankrupt, and the economy is dominated by these large foreign companies. Very often, these countries sign these agreements with Europe or the United States or Japan, because of political reasons, not because of economic reasons. They want to feel very close to the US or to Europe. Or sometimes they sign because they are ignorant. They thought that the agreement was something to do with selling clothes to the United States. And they did not know that it would lead to this kind of disasters. Bolivia is very lucky because in recent years, you decided not to cooperate with the World Bank and IMF anymore, and you have refused to sign the free trade agreement with Europe or United States. So you have been very fortunate. Otherwise, the economy will be colonized and the people will be suffering. But this good fortune cannot be guaranteed. In fact, there is a strong likelihood that in the future, you will fall into the trap. The big companies and the big banks are very powerful, and they are able to influence their governments in the United States, in Europe, and so on, to continue to put pressure on the developing countries, especially those who did not want to sign these agreements. And these Western countries, they do not sleep at night, they work day and night. So, if you don't want to sign these agreements, if you don't want to cooperate by allowing their companies to come in, they will try to educate the population wrongly through the universities, through the newspapers, through all kinds of cultural methods, in order for the people themselves to pressurize the government to give up. Of course, as you know, they also use electronic surveillance. They use the technology to look into your email, your telephone calls, even if you're the president, especially if you're the president. Poor President Dilma in Brazil, her mobile phone was tapped. Whatever she tells her mother, her children, her husband, or her boyfriend, whatever it is, the Americans know every move that she's making, even in her personal life. So I think it is the duty of all of us, those of us who are intellectuals. We are scholars, we are academics, we are people working in the government, we are people working in the companies. We have to read up and get to know what this situation is so that we are not influenced through the television, through the academic studies made in the US or EU, through the NGOs. There are real NGOs like myself and Nina. There are false NGOs who are set up by the State Department in order to influence the people or even sponsor the people in our countries to oppose the kind of policies that the government may have that may be good policies. If we don't upgrade our own knowledge and if we don't take our own action, one day our country, whatever country it is, your country, Bolivia, my country, Malaysia, may fall into the colonial trap once more. So in June we are holding the summit. The political leaders of developing countries will come to Santa Cruz. We will be celebrating 50 years of the unity of the developing countries in trying to fight against the injustice and the imbalance in the global economy, which is still controlled by the Western countries and by the big companies. This is the main reason why we are meeting, to celebrate these 50 years and to look ahead to the next 50 years where we can continue our battle. Bolivia now has the chance to take a leadership position on behalf of all the developing countries in that summit, as well as in the battles that we are fighting this year in the United Nations, in the Climate Convention, where Diabo is the leader of the Bolivian delegation, and I can tell you that he's doing extremely well as a fighter. So, whether you know it or not, Bolivia is the leader this year